All right. John chapter 8 and 9 is our class today. Let me tell you what goes on in actually John 7 and 8 and 9. In John 7 and 8, it's a difficult section to read and to really get your head around privately because most of it is a conversation. And anytime you're reading a dialogue, a conversation, and you don't have like pictures and actors that are acting it out, it's kind of difficult to stay focused on the conversation. But let me tell you what the conversation is, and then we'll get into some parts of it and discuss a little bit. Jesus in John chapter 7 goes to the temple and the Feast of Booths. He goes to Jerusalem, he goes to the temple, and on the Temple Mount, there's these great covered porticos and this great open area, a mall kind of around the actual temple. And Jesus is out there in among all the people, and he begins to teach the people in the temple. And one of the things that's happening, the key thing that's happening in John 7 and 8, is that there's a disagreement among the people going on about what they're going to think about Jesus. Some people have one opinion of him, some people have another opinion of him, and they keep going back and forth at each other with their contradicting opinions about Jesus, some positive, some negative. And this is very important in the function of this gospel because it gives the reader who's reading this gospel sometime late in the first century in Ephesus, it gives the reader a chance to weigh the pros and cons about whether they're going to accept Jesus or not accept Jesus, see? And so the pros and cons that these people are voicing may be the very pros and cons that the people who are reading this are thinking about in their own minds. So it's sort of like, you know, the old song that we used to sing in church, what will you do with Jesus? The question comes to you, and you must give an answer for something you must do. What shall it be? What shall it be? What shall your answer be? See? So this is exactly what's going on in John 7 and 8 in the format of Jesus teaching and people voicing different opinions about Jesus. The key verse, and let's look at it, in John 7, verse 24. This is the key verse of these two chapters of discussion. And this is where Jesus says, do not judge according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Now, many people who study the Bible like picking verses out of their context might put this verse in the context of a discussion of judging, like judging other people or saying things about other people when you don't really know what's going on. That's really not what this is about. If you want to talk about that, go to Matthew 7 or some other passage that's really about that. Matthew 7, why are you picking at the little speck in your brother's eye when you've got a board in your own eye? Take care of your own problems before you start trying to take care of other people's problems. That's the judging thing as we usually talk about it. But in this passage, in John 7:24, Jesus is talking about people making up their minds about him. What are they going to do with Jesus? Are they going to really embrace him, accept him into their life, or are they going to reject him? And this is a judgment, this is a decision that each person must make for himself or herself, see? And so Jesus warns as they're trying to make that decision about Jesus, you better judge correctly here. You better judge righteous judgment. If you decide to accept me or reject me, you better judge righteous judgment. See, there's no greater decision that anybody makes in their entire life than this decision. So you better make a good judgment. That's what John 7:24 means. But it's interesting that statement, which is Jesus's statement about this whole thing, is right in the middle of all this controversy about him. See, pros and cons, pros and cons, pros and cons. And he says, you better make a right judgment when you decide. Nobody can decide but you. If you look at John 7, verse 5, as Jesus was going to Jerusalem because the Feast of Tabernacles was there. His brothers wanted him to go and basically go show yourself to all your fans. They were not his fans. And it says in John 7, verse 5, that his brothers did not believe on him. Wow. So to the reader, does that go on the pro side or the con side? Well, that goes on the cons. Even his brothers did not believe on him. And we know from later on that James and Judas, they wrote 2 books of the New Testament, James and Jude. We call him Jude instead of Judas. His name was Judas. But they wrote 2 books of the New Testament, and they certainly believed on him. In Acts chapter 1, his brothers are there waiting in the upper room. So after the resurrection, he appeared to James, and they began to believe on him. But at this point, his brothers don't believe on him. And he goes to the feast, and he begins to get into this crowd that's in the temple quarter, and he starts listening to what they're saying, and then he starts teaching, and they keep giving opinions. So are you going to accept Jesus, or are you going to reject Jesus? All right. So I found this little picture about people debating pros and cons, for and against, and this fits very well with John chapter 7. So in John chapter 7, verse 12, it says there was grumbling about him in the crowd, and some said, he's a good man. And others said, no, he's deceiving the crowd. Well, today, how many times have you heard discussions? This whole thing about Jesus, maybe he was a good guy. Maybe he was a fine man. But all this stuff about, Jesus being the Son of God and being born of a virgin and coming, that's just total deception. And, you've got people going back and forth with those kinds of opinions, just like they were here, see? And so Jesus began to teach them. And look at verse 15. It says that the Jews said, how does this man know letters, never having learned? That's literally what it says. How does this man seem to be so good in the scriptures and everything if he's never been to school, if he's never been to rabbinical school? See, this is a pro. How can he know this much about God and God's word if he's never been to school? See, but then Jesus comes back and says, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Verse 16. It didn't come from school. It came from him and from God. See, God revealing it to him. Earlier in the Gospel of John, John 3:34, talking about Jesus, he whom God sent speaks the words of God. Here he says, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. John 12:49, I did not speak of myself, but the Father who sent me has given me command what I should say and what I should speak. See? So he didn't claim any originality or erudition about the things that he taught. He said, I got it all directly from my Father, from God. But here you have these people, picture a crowd of people shouting out different things. He's a good man. Yes, he is. Yes, he is. No, he's not. He's deceiving the crowd. And this is going back and forth among the people that are there. You have in part of this, he healed that guy at the pool. And some other person replies, but he has a demon. Some people here said he has a demon. Look at verse 20. The crowd answered, he has a demon. You have a demon. See? And Jesus says to them in verse 20, I did one work, one sign, and you all marveled. He's talking about the healing of the man at the pool, see? So some people give him credit for the healing, and they say he must be from God, and other people say he's got a demon, he's crazy. He's making himself equal with God. And so you have, again, the pros and the cons. Turn over to John chapter 7, verse 45. Officers came to the chief priests and the Pharisees, and of course they were sent by the chief priests and Pharisees to arrest Jesus. And they, the chief priests, said to them, the officers, why didn't you arrest him? And the officers said, nobody ever spoke like that man. I mean, they were blown away by Jesus' teaching. Nobody ever spoke like he did. And they came back empty-handed. So on one side, the chief priests, the supposed religious leaders of the day, are saying, arrest him. We need to kill him. And the officers come back, you don't understand. Nobody ever spoke like this guy. Okay, back up with me just a little bit to verse 40. Look at verse 40. So out of the crowd, some who heard these things said, he's truly the prophet. But others said, he's the Christ. But others said, no, he can't be. For the Christ doesn't come out of Galilee. You know, doesn't the scripture say that he's to be of the seed of David and he's from Bethlehem, the village of David, when the Christ comes? So he's from Nazareth. He's supposed to be from Bethlehem. Well, we know from reading Matthew that he was born in Bethlehem, see? But the crowd doesn't know. And so here you have the pros and the cons, the backs and the forths, see? And they're arguing about Jesus. Again, the whole thing, as I've got between the little podiums there, is John 7:24, Jesus saying, you better be careful what decision you make. Judge, righteous judgment. Make a good decision here. And then way into the end of John chapter 7, he claims to be from God. And actually, this is in John chapter 8. Turn over to John chapter 8. And verse 57. Let's actually begin at verse 56. Abraham our father rejoiced to see my day, and he was glad. And the Jews therefore said to him, you're not even 50 years old. And how is it that you've seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him, and he went forth out of the temple. So he claims to be from God, and they shout blasphemy, kill him, And so here's your two choices. It's if you really read the Bible, I know when you get into discussions, some of you get in discussions with your friends, or you go on the internet and you look at discussions and so forth, and that's all well and good. But if you really read the actual Bible, okay, you basically only got two choices here, because Jesus claims to be God in the flesh. There's no way around that, To accept Jesus is to accept the whole thing. You don't partially accept him. You don't accept him on the fringes. You either accept him all the way or you reject him all the way. These are your choices. But the point of this whole discussion is make a right judgment. So let's reflect for a minute on the whole gospel up to this point. Okay, you're in chapter 1. He starts out claiming he's the Logos of God that created the world and that he became flesh, that he's the light of the world. John the Baptist says he's the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. See? Nicodemus is startled by the fact that he knows things Nicodemus did when nobody was around. And he says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. John chapter 1, verse 49 or something like that, 40 something or other. And so you've got that opinion. Then John says he's Jacob's ladder, the end of John chapter 1. He's the good wine that's been saved till now by God in John chapter 2. He's the temple destroyer and the temple builder in John chapter 2. In John chapter 3, one of the rulers of the Jews comes and says, Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher come from God, because no man can do these signs that you do unless God be with him. John 3, 1 and 2. See, Nicodemus. Then you meet the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4, and she goes to her village after her encounter with Jesus, and she says, come see a man that told me everything I ever did. And then they all come to see Jesus, the villagers do. And at John 4, verse 43 or somewhere in that neighborhood, the people of that village say, now we believe, not because of what you said, but because we have heard for ourselves, and we know indeed that this is the Savior of the world. And then in John 5, that guy at the pool, he heals him. Do you want to get well, like we talked about last time? And he makes the man well, and the guys haul him on the carpet and say, who made you well? And he says, that guy. And how did he make you well? And, and Jesus says, look, you've been made well. Well, he made me well. See, what else do you want to know? And then you get to John chapter 6, and he feeds the 5,000, and they say, this must be the prophet. And they try to make him king. And then he says, I'm the bread of life. He who comes to me will never hunger. He who believes on me will never thirst. And then he goes to the feast in Jerusalem in chapter 7 and 8, and you have this lengthy discussion. Pros and cons, pros and cons, pros and cons. What do you think of him? What do you think of him? And why do you think it? So let me ask you a reflection question here. If you reject Jesus in your mind, do you do that because you've really thought through all the alternatives and you think that's the best choice? Do you do that because somebody or some person somewhere hurt you at some time and they were connected with the church? Do you reject Jesus because you found a better way of life? Have you really lately sat and considered the alternatives? But the central point that I want to leave you with from John 7 and 8 is this. Do not judge by appearance. You better judge righteous judgment. That's John 7, verse 24. That's the nut of those two chapters. Okay? Who'd like to bring up something about any of that before I go on? Keith? All right, Keith's question is, it seems odd that with all the signs that he's been doing, he would say don't judge by appearances. The reason that that's being said in the flow of the discussion is the Jewish leaders, which are very powerful, the Pharisees, they were teaching in all the synagogues that all these people attended. The Sadducees, or the priests, they were the ones that took their sacrifices at the temple. See, so these are a very powerful group. And they're saying that because Jesus healed the man at the pool on the Sabbath day and told him to pick up his bed, that he violated the Sabbath. And they're saying he violated the Sabbath, and therefore he can't be the Messiah. And so by appearances, according to these people, he violated the Sabbath, so he can't be real. And they're saying things like, we know where he's from. He's from Nazareth, and we know from the Bible that he's supposed to come from Bethlehem. Well, by appearance, he was from Nazareth, but they didn't realize that he was born in Bethlehem and then moved to Nazareth. So that's part of the reason for that statement there. Barry?
Opinion of it based on his outward appearance. If you look how the priests and the Sadducees dressed, they were robes and tassels and prayer cloths, and you could pick them out in the crowd, and Jesus didn't fit that mold.
He was just a guy, wasn't he?
He was just a guy.
Yeah, Mark?
The bigger picture of the rejection of the law and the plan of God is towards justice, mercy, and righteousness. And they got focused in an area of life that took them, and they didn't understand that projection. And when Christ came and started demonstrating that, as in Matthew 23, he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, which are justice, mercy, and faithfulness.
Yes.
It's a philosophical thing that they just couldn't see in Jesus, that he was declaring with everything that he did.
Right. So Mark's, for those of you that couldn't hear, his comment was that the Jewish leaders got lost in the minutia of the technicalities of the law and their additions to the law, and they were forgetting justice, mercy, and righteousness, the things that were the big overarching truths about following God, and Jesus emphasized those. All of that is very true. So think of this as personal, because the book of John is pressing us, everybody who reads it, to decide what we're going to do. Now, some of you say, well, I decided years ago. Okay, I hear that, but there's a sense in which we need to re-up on that periodically. We need to make sure we're deciding again that we're going to stick with our decision. You see what I'm saying? Did I make the right decision or not? Judge right judgment. And if I'm really deciding at whatever point of life I'm in right now to follow Jesus, then I need to take that rather seriously, right? Not in some half-hearted type of way. Okay, so in John chapter 8, at the end of it, you have the Pharisees and priests trying to stone Jesus. A couple of little verses here, and we'll move on a little bit. Look at John 8:12, which is going to help us as we go into chapter 9. One of the statements of Jesus. Again, therefore, Jesus spoke to them. He's still at the temple with all these people. He says, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life. So if you accept Jesus, you follow Jesus, and you walk in the light. Then also look at verse 31, John 8, verse 31. Jesus therefore said to the ones who believed on him, of the Jews who believed on him, if you remain in my word, then you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And then, of course, there follows this discussion about whose children are you, and they claim to be children of Abraham, and he says, no, you can't be, because if you were, you wouldn't do like you're doing. They claim to be children of God. Jesus says, no, you can't be. And finally, Jesus says, you're children of the devil, John 8, verse 44. And then we go from there. One last little thing in here, if I can find it real quickly, John 7, verse 43. John 7, verse 43. Again, this is a long conversation. I'm just picking some highlights out of it. John 7, 43. There arose a division in the crowd because of him. That's repeated 2 or 3 times during the Gospel of John. There will always be a division between those who truly accept and embrace Jesus and those who do not, because the thought processes and the lifestyle of those who truly embrace Jesus are going to be really different than the thought processes and the lifestyle of the ones who do not. There cannot help but be divisions of sorts between those people. And so when you judge this judgment, when you make this decision about Jesus, you're making a lot of peripheral decisions at the same time, are you not? Because if you really walk that path, it will cause you difficulties with some people you may have been walking with before who don't want to walk that path. So that's just part of the process. Okay. Let's move to chapter 9. He said in John 8:12 in the discussion, I am the light of the world. But chapter 9 is the chapter that gives you the sign and the meaning of the sign that Jesus is the light of the world. It's about this guy that was born blind. John 9:1, and passing along, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents that he should be born blind? I mean, what a tragedy. Somebody must really be being punished by God for this. Jesus answered, neither one, neither this man nor his parents, but so that the works of God might be made manifest in him. Let us work the works of God. We must work the works of God, or the works of him that sent me while it is yet day. The night comes when no man can work. So Jesus is going to do something here that's highly significant. Now think about this blind guy. There are varying degrees of blindness, but this guy had been blind from birth. So think about total darkness from birth. I don't know how old the guy was, but a long time. Total darkness. Never anything but total darkness. Never saw a face, never saw a color, never saw a sunset, never saw into the distance, had no concept of distance and space except for very tiny, small spaces. Complete closure in darkness from birth. Now that's extreme, yet the book of John calls Jesus the light from the very beginning. And it says in John 1, verse 9, he was the true light which lightens every man coming into the world. See? So really, if we understand John, all of us without Jesus are in total darkness. I mean, we can't see. We sing this song, light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see. Right? John chapter 9. Okay, so Jesus is in that mode, and in verse 5, notice what he says to this blind guy right before he heals him. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, why say that right now? Because in one fell swoop, he's fixing to bring this man out of total darkness into light. See? Now, you've been in this class for a while, so you know that there's darkness with a little d and darkness with a big D. There's light with a little L, and there's light with a big L. See, darkness is the absence of light as far as physical things go, but there's a mental, spiritual, transcendent darkness. And all of us who without Jesus are in that darkness. And so, he says, while I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. When he said these things, verse 6, he spit on the ground, and he made mud or clay out of the spittle, and he put it on the man's eyes, put the clay on his eyes, and he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Now, if this was another gospel, it would just be the fact, go wash in Siloam. But notice what John does. He says that means sent. Sent. Now, in the Gospel of John, who is the one who was sent? Well, that's Jesus. John 3:34, he whom God sent speaketh the words of God. See, that's Jesus. John 20, verse 21, just as the Father sent me, even so send I you. See, Jesus is the one sent. Isn't it weird that he says, go wash in Siloam, go wash in the pool of the one who was sent, and you will see. Now, this guy literally goes and washes in a literal pool, Siloam, and his eyes are literally opened where now the light comes in and he can see everything like he's never. But is it not true of every one of us that we must go to Siloam and wash before we can see? You understand? This is the spirituality of the Gospel of John. We must go to Siloam and wash. So the scripture here says, He came back seeing. Now, can you imagine the totality of the transformation of this guy's world when, for the first time in umpteen years since birth, all of a sudden, he's confronted with everything, with colors, with buildings, with faces, with distance, with sunrises and sunsets, with streets and carts and donkeys and fruit and the colors, everything. I mean, it's like you're talking about a huge, huge awareness and paradigm shift for this guy by just physically opening his eyes, right? Huge. Now, this is a little bit different than if somebody had been a sighted person and then at some point in their life had lost sight, because they would already have that perspective. But this guy did not have that perspective at all. I mean, it just really opened his eyes. And so when he came back seeing, notice what happened. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said it's him, and others said, "No, can't be. It's somebody like him." The guy was so different seeing that some people didn't even recognize him as the same guy. Is this getting through or not? Because when somebody, I'm not talking about somebody in a moment says, "Oh yeah, I want Jesus to be my Savior," and then goes back to living their life as they always have, and they don't really let him in all the way. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when somebody really embraces Christ in their life. People are going to say, "Is this the same lady? Is this the same guy? Is this that same person? What's so different about you?" Well, the difference is you were blind and now you see. So you'll notice here in this passage, like those of you that were in the class, past lessons, remember like when we were doing the one about the temple, I told you to underline in that passage all the place where it said temple and house and all that kind of stuff. And remember when we were doing the one about the woman at the well, I told you to underline water and thirsty and drink and all those all the way down through there. And so in this passage, what you have is your eyes were opened, blind and see, those different things. So the guy says, "I'm him." And they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" Well, if you go back to chapter 5, the guy at the pool, "How'd you get well? Who made you well? How did he make you well?" Over and over again. And this question, see, that keeps coming up draws you right back to who? It was Jesus that did that to me. It was Jesus that made me well. So, verse 14 says, "Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes." So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. He opened his eyes, received his sight. He told them about the mud and the pool and all the rest of them. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. Does that sound familiar? See, there's always going to be. And so they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him since," what did he do? "He opened your eyes." See, this terribly hard to get around truth just sits there. He opened this guy's eyes. He opened your eye. He opened my eyes. See, this is what he did. And the guy says he's a prophet. No doubt in my mind. So down at verse 19, they call his parents in, the blind man's parents. And they said, "Is this your son whom you say was born blind?" Look at their question. How does this guy now see? See, the reader's looking at this and he's reading this. How does this guy now see? How can that be? His parents answered, well, we know that this is our son, that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we don't know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. He's of age. Ask him yourself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. So the parents knew that this was their son, and they knew that Jesus had opened his eyes, but they wouldn't confess it because they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. Now, Mark, we've talked about faith a lot. Okay, now let's talk about this. In the Gospel of John, faith has two key elements. One part of it, which doesn't go far enough, is intellectual conviction. Intellectual conviction is part A. Okay? These parents had that, and later on we're going to read about some other guys that had that, but they did not want to take it any further. They did not want to confess him. They did not want to totally align with him. They did not want to totally embrace him. That's really what faith is. It's a choice. Okay? So faith is intellectual conviction, and it's also a choice. But without the choice, we don't really have the kind of believing that the Gospel of John is after. See? Because I'm going to trust him myself. I've decided. That's a choice. And even when you're wavering, when life is really throwing all that stuff at you, you know, and it's so difficult, it's so hard, doesn't that choice crop up again in your mind and you say, is it really worth this? And don't you again sometimes have to choose again to keep trusting Jesus in spite of all the junk? Do you or not? Am I wrong or right? Yes, see. So the parents knew this, but they were afraid to choose to follow Jesus. And they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. If you choose Jesus, some people in your life are going to put you out of the synagogue, probably. That's just the way it is. Okay, Shauna's comment here was very good. She says, that's a very big social crisis because back in that time, you know, the synagogue was like the center of life and all their friends and everything else. And it would be huge to be put out of the synagogue. Absolutely. Absolutely. Those communities, very tight. So again, down in verse, what is it? I can't read there. It's 24. They called the man who had been blind and said to him, we know that this man is a sinner. And he answered, whether he's a sinner, I do not know. Bingo, look at what he says. I just know one thing. I was blind, and now I see. Yes, Hunter, sorry, buddy. Yes. All right, this is a great question. His question is, you know, it says earlier in the chapter that he was doing these things so that God would be glorified. These were physical signs like the ones that he did to this blind man. Was there a spiritual salvation component for these, like with this blind man? Okay. So a good answer to that, if you go back to John 5 and you look at the guy healed at the pool, and Jesus made him well physically, and it's about 15, 16, 17, somewhere in there. I can't remember the exact verse, but Jesus comes to the guy, it might be verse 14. He comes to the guy after the healing, and he says, now you've been made well. Go and sin no more, so that a worse fate might not befall you. And so there still had to be a choice by this person who was healed to follow Jesus. So now we would like to assume that this blind man followed Jesus. He probably did, and it looks like he did if we read the rest of the chapter, but he still had to choose that. See? And so the sign itself is designed to show us one thing, that Jesus really is the light of the world. And you are in darkness until you allow Jesus to open your eyes, so to speak. But you and I still have to allow him to open our eyes if we're going to have the blessing that goes along with the meaning of this sign. Okay, so look at the Samaritan woman. She seems to have come all the way to trusting in Jesus, and we don't know what happened in the rest of her life, but she was so excited she told other people, and we'd like to assume that she chose to follow Jesus. But John kind of leaves the reader hanging with this, like John 7:24. Remember the central verse of that 7 and 8? Judge, righteous judgment. You better make a good decision. Okay? All right, time to quit. I've talked too much, and y'all have been real good, and we'll see you.